Alright, so I am back. I have no idea what happened to me, but for a couple days I had a pretty bad sore throat and could barely talk. Now, I didn't catch like a cold or a fever or anything. My throat just kind of got a little swollen and it hurt to talk and swallow and all that fun stuff. So I'm feeling a lot better now. So I decided to try out creating a video today and we'll see how it goes, because I added something that I think is quite cool to a CLI that I created. So I recently created a CLI called Create GraphQL API, and I added a --auth flag. So what this CLI does is it sets you up with a GraphQL project or API that's configured with TypeScript and a few other libraries. So I added this auth flag, and this is going to get you started with a authentication template. So get you on your way with setting up authentication with GraphQL and TypeScript and the entire stack that I like to use. So this is how you can use it. You type npx, and then this is my CLI name, and then this is just the name of my project, so I called it. And then here, this is just the auth flag to get the auth template. Alright, so when we run that, and I have the project open up here, and what I'm going to do in this video is kind of just walk you through what the template is and then how to use it, and show you the different parts of it. So I'm going to start on the index.ts file. So I decided for this to go with sessions over JWTs. Now the reason I chose to do that, I like both of them, but I feel like sessions are a smidge easier to set up. So I decided to choose that for at least the initial one. So that's what you're going to be seeing in this video, but I still like JWTs. I think they're a great option if you prefer to use them. Alright, so let's talk about what I did to set this up. So to start off with, you'll notice I'm creating a session object here, or a session store. So it's a SQLite. And again, the reason why I chose SQLite here to store our sessions is because we're already using SQLite for our database. Now, if you have, or if you want to set up some other stuff on your computer, my ideal setup is to use Postgres for the database and to set up Redis for sessions. And I put a link here if you want to do that. This is the Connect Redis that you can use. But it is a little difficult to set up Redis on Windows, so I wanted something that was very easy to get started with. And the API is exactly the same. If you want to switch to Redis later, it's very easy. You just switch out this store. Alright, so this is just us declaring where we're going to store sessions. And we get this from Express Session. Alright, we initialize our Express app. And the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to add the Session Middleware. Now it's very important to put this at the beginning of creating the Express app, because I want this to be the first thing that runs before my GraphQL resolvers and any other Express middleware or stuff that I add. So the order matters. And here you can see I'm creating a session middleware, and there's a few things that I'm configuring. So here you're seeing me specify the DB that I'm using, SQLite to store the data. Here I'm just naming the cookie. Here is the secret I'm using for the cookie. I usually recommend storing this in a environment variable, so I have that here. But I set a default in case you don't set this variable, and it's just a random string. Here I set resave to false and save uninitialized. This just saves you from constantly refreshing and saving the session when nothing changes and you haven't added any data yet. So I like to turn those off. I feel like they're not really necessary. And then here's just options for creating a cookie. So here I can set HTTP only to true. This is a good option for security reasons, so people can't access your cookie. Secure. This is so it only works in HTTPS, so you can see I only turn this on in production. And maybe I should just add a little comment. That's for HTTPS. Your cookie will only work in this environment if you set this to true. And then I just set the age for the cookie. I just set that to 7 years. Feel free to modify this to what you want. Usually I just set it for a long time because you can invalidate a session whenever you want. So the fact that it's initially for a long time, in my opinion, is an okay thing. Alright, so here I have us establishing the database connection. Now, you'll notice I do this in kind of an interesting way. So here I have this get connection function. This comes from Typeworm, and I actually pass in the node environment. In case this is undefined, I default to development. And so what this does is it actually reads the ormconfig.js. And what I did here is I set up a development and a production environment. So you'll notice here I'm using SQLite in dev and Postgres in production. And so it just switches between those. And so it just, in development, it's going to use this, in production it uses this. So it switches between these two configuration files. You'll also notice that I had to change the name here to default. This is just so the entities pick up the name for the connection. It doesn't work very well if you use a different name other than default here, unless you want to specify every time you do a database interaction which name you want. Alright, so next up is us initializing Apollo server. Main thing to look at here is us in the context. So we're putting the request and the response in the context for our resolvers. Reason for this is we can access this in our resolvers and get the session, which we're going to see in a second. Here we are building the type GraphQL schema, taking in our resolvers. And I'm not using any validation decorators that type GraphQL has an option for, so I just set this to false. And here, this is just in type GraphQL, Apollo, how you apply the middleware to the express object. So we just call apply there. Here I'm setting the port. I'm using process.m.port, so this is compatible with Heroku, but if you don't set the port, it defaults to port 4000. And we just start up. So that's the index file and the start of things. Let's talk about our Auth Resolver now. So we don't need this. Alright, so we're going to start at the top, and you can see this is a type GraphQL resolver, so I'm using the resolver decorator, and this is a class. We got a mutation here that returns a user response. So my register mutation, this is how we are going to sign up users, and it returns a user response. So let's look at that. So this is kind of a generic response to get a user. So I may return a null for the user if there's any errors. So this object either returns a user or an error usually, but both can be a null. So these are just both nullable fields, and we'll usually return one of them. We'll see what that is in practice in a second. But this is an object type from type GraphQL, and we just assign these two to fields. And so the user here, can take a look at this. You can see I'm using the user class. This is a Typeworm entity, and notice I'm using this for my database and for my GraphQL type. Right, so this ID field is both a GraphQL field and a primary generated column, which is a Typeworm database ID thing. You'll also notice that, for example, we can also exclude fields that we don't want to expose over a GraphQL API. In this case, I don't want to expose my password field, so I just have it as a column and not a field. But the email and ID I'm fine with. Actually, I want to go back to my user response. All right, so that's what the user field is. And then my errors field, this is the structure of how I like to return errors in GraphQL. So I have this error object, which I call field error, which has the path. This is usually what I say the name of the field that has the error. For example, it may be the email field, the password field is incorrect, or maybe I'm typing a title of something and the title is incorrect. So this tells you the field that's wrong, and this is the what's wrong about it. For example, it needs to be at least 10 characters or something like that. All right, so that's our user response. And so the first thing we do in this register mutation, we have an auth input. In our auth input here, we have an email and a password. So this is just us accepting arguments to our mutation. And I have an input type here, so they pass in an object. And so I can decompose the email and the password, or destructure, not decompose. And then here I have, the first thing that I do is I hash the password that they pass in here. This is what we're actually going to store in our database. And so we'll see that down here in a second. And actually, now that I think of it, I'm not really sure why I have hashing the password at the top here. Let's move it down. because really the first thing that I want to do is check if the user exists first. So here is, you'll see the first error handling that I'm doing. So for example here, I like to check if a user exists. So I'm going to fetch a user by user.findOne from our database, checking against the email. And then here I check if we have an existing user. If we do, I'm going to return this error. So this is what an error message would look like, me sending back to the client. All right, so it's an array of objects, an array of errors, and this is what an error would look like. Path, the email is wrong. The message, it's already in use. All right, so now we can hash the password. No need to hash it before because we may throw an error. Well, not throw, just return an error. And then we save our user. We create our user, passing in our email and the hashed password. And then I return that user. So you can notice here our user response is flexible. We either return errors or we return a user like that. All right, so with our login, I can use that same user. So that's how we created users. Now let's talk about how you can actually authenticate them or log them in. So I return a user also from logging in. We also use this same auth input. Now we have a special new guy here. This is how you get the context in type GraphQL. So we use this @ctx decorator, and this is how you get access to the context using type GraphQL. This is how you specify what your type is. So this is the just the end interface for the type of my context. And you'll notice I have just the request and the response from Express in here. And you'll notice back in our index, these are the two things we're passing in here. All right. First thing I do is I fetch a user. And if we were not able to find a user with the email they tried to log in with, we returned an invalid login response. So I returned this 2 times. You can see here and here. So I decided to just put this in a variable up here. And this is an error response. And we can see we're returning an array and our object. The reason why I'm making this an array too is sometimes you may want to return more than one error. In this case, we're just returning one though. So email, invalid login. So I made this generic just to tell them invalid login and not give them any more information. We also check with bcrypt that the password they pass in is equal to the hashed password. And so we use bcrypt compare for that, and we check if it's valid. If it's not valid, they pass in the wrong password. We say invalid login session. And then here we actually set the session for the user. And so this is what persists the user. So we say context.request, and then the request has a session object on it. Now I like to just use the exclamation mark in TypeScript. Now what that does is it asserts something is not null or not undefined. So you can see that this session object can sometimes be undefined. I like to just say that it is defined because I know I added the middleware over here. And so in my session, I can store arbitrary data on the user. In this case, I'm just storing the user ID. So this session is just an object. I can store whatever I want. This is just what I'm storing. And what that's going to do is it's going to actually send back a cookie for the user. And we're going to look at the cookie in a second. Now this is how, after the user logs in, how we can get the existing user. So I like to make a me query, which just returns a user. Now we also return null, possibly if we can't find the user. So what we do is we get access to the context, and we just read the session to get the user ID that they set over here. So you see how we set the user ID? Here we just read the user ID. Now if it's undefined, that's why I have a not there, we just return undefined. We can also return null here. That might be a little cleaner. Not really cleaner, just another way you could do it. But you could also return just undefined there. That's what I did. All right, so user.findOne here is where we're actually just fetching the user based on the user ID that is in the session. And so that's how we actually return the current user. And then lastly is logging users out. So for this, we're just going to return true or false whether it worked. And then what we do is we look at the context again. And here you can see I'm returning a promise. The reason why I'm doing this is because we want to call this destroy function. And this destroy function returns or uses as a parameter a callback. And so to turn a callback into a promise, to be able to use it here, I can do new promise like that. And so this is a function. And then here I say context.request.session, and I'm destroying the current session. And then here I just check if there's an error. If there is, I reject in console log. The error reject is this, and just say something went wrong. Resolve means it worked, and then we can return true from that. And this destroys the session in SQLite or wherever we're storing it, but doesn't actually clear the cookie. This is how you can clear the cookie if you want to clear it as well. So this is just me calling clear cookie on this. And this is the name of the cookie that we set over here. All right, so before we actually demo this, there's actually one last thing I want to show you. So when users can now log in, we want to prevent them from accessing some things if they're not logged in. So for example, I want to show you one way you can set this up that's very simple and repeatable. So this is a book query that I wanted to be protected. So what I did is I used the use middleware decorator from TypeGraphQL. And I passed in a middleware function that I created called isAuth. And what that does is it's going to throw an error if they're not logged in. So now I can, whatever query mutation I want, I can stick this middleware in front, and it will check whether the user's logged in and throw an error if they're not. So it's very easy to do a auth check. And we can see what this looks like. This is just the format of a TypeGraphQL middleware. So this is the type definition we use, or the interface. This is the actual function. So here is an object where we can access any kind of information about the current resolver. All right, so I can also get the arguments, info, root. In this case, I really only care about the context. And then next is how you go to the next middleware. You want to make sure you call this. So all I do here is I check if the user ID is not defined. If they don't have a user ID, I know they're not logged in, and I throw an error. Otherwise, I go to the next middleware. So it's actually very simple to create this. Okay. So that's our middleware. Let's actually see this in action. So I have my server started up. I just did yarn start to start it. And so I go over here to localhost 4000/GraphQL. So the first thing I'm going to try to do, let me just make sure I'm not logged in. I'm going to right click inspect. And if I click on application, click on cookies, I can see all of the cookies that I have. So application, cookies over here on the left, and then this guy here. So I'm just going to remove this, clear all cookies that I have to make sure I'm not logged in. And we'll just close this for now. So first thing I'm going to try to do is access our book. Alright, so you'll notice I get an error not authenticated. So now, I'm going to create a user for myself. By the way, if you push Control Space in here, that's how you can get the auto completion. And I'm not doing any kind of validation on the errors message. Any kind of validation on the email, you may want to do that, so I can just pass Bob in here. Or I could be a good citizen, do that. And we'll use the same thing for our password. Alright, so here I'm going to create a user. Oh, I already created this user. That probably makes sense. I like to use this. Let's do Bob2. Copy that. But here you go. This is just to show you an example of what the error message looks like. Error response. Alright, so create Bob2. This is what it looks like when you get a successful register. Now, let's log in with our Bob user. and I kind of just prettyfied and moved it over. Maybe I should just bring this down. But this is our mutation. And again, passing the same email password in here. Now I'm going to run this. Now, this is actually not going to work. So for example, if I go to my, or I don't think it'll work. We'll see if it does. If I click this, we see I'm still getting not authenticated. Now the reason for that is a cookie did not get set. So it's very important that a cookie gets set, or none of this works. All right, so if I look at my cookie tab here, I don't see a cookie here. Now the reason why, if I go to my settings, there's one called request.credentials that is set to omit. This needs to be set to include. So by default, it throws out cookies, and this we want to include them. So now when I log in, if I inspect my application, I should have a cookie here now. And we can see QID there. So now when I try to access the book, I'm able to access we get the Republic, which is the good response from the book. So the last thing to show you is just also how me now works. I didn't show it not working, but we can log out and show that. So you can see I can now get who the current user is, Bob2, based on that cookie. So that cookie is how I'm being identified. And let's just log out. Looks like it worked. And now we get null for me and not authenticated for the book. Okay, so there you go. That's kind of a demo of how all those things work. And now we can kind of layer on top of this the mutations that you want and the queries they want to add to this. I have a single book query. Where did I put it? There it is, my book resolver, and that has this isAuth. But you can pair with this Auth Resolver anything you want. This is just a good place to start your project off with. This is kind of how I like to do authentication, and it is as simple as I could make it. So there you go. I hope that helps you get started and gets you on your way for implementing your own authentication in GraphQL.